Okay, everyone, so you know that Sunday is Essay 2. Basically the same idea as the first paper, but you just have to find at least one research source from our library. Okay, and even though if you look at the instructions, you can take any topic from our textbook and write your argument for or against it, essentially. But remember, we talked about this, where you can use some other topics that we talked about. And really, you can choose any topic of your choice. The only requirements are that, first of all, it has to be an arguable topic. It's not just a report, but something that you can argue. And then secondly, remember to find a research source. And as far as the essay for this week, it's just a really short essay, and it's about Snapchat. So just out of curiosity, how many of you use Snapchat? Yeah, a lot of you do. By the way, they're doing some construction outside here, so let me know if it gets too loud and I'll go to another room. But yeah, Snapchat, it's something that's really popular these days. I gotta be honest, I don't use Snapchat, but so you guys know a lot more about it than I do. But what are some of the advantages of Snapchat? Or what are some of the cool things about Snapchat? What do you use it for? Text people, communication with friends. Yeah, you know, it's interesting because it's amazing how digital technology has changed and how these social media tools have changed. Like, so for example, MySpace was popular back in the day, but that was kind of a mess. Lots of cluster, lots of clutter, and it was just poorly designed. Then came along Facebook, which is also pretty cool at first, but just the features of Snapchat is a lot better, I think. So one kind of announcement is that I know that I said that I'll be doing more bonus sessions. Actually, unfortunately, that might not turn out to be true just because I have another part-time job during the other days. So I'll try to do that the best that we can, but I'll also cover some of these bonus topics in class here. So let's pick up with Malcolm Gladwell. So I'm going to be showing you a lot of videos today, and we're not going to finish Gladwell today, but we'll finish it on Wednesday. So I think we left off right here where we were talking about blink. And even though a lot of times our instinctive snap decisions can be very effective and very good, a lot of times they're not so good, unfortunately. And one of the things, have you guys ever heard of D.B. Cooper? So no, Helena, I'll let you know later today, an announcement for if we do one tomorrow, okay? Okay, so D.B. Cooper was the only person in US history to successfully hijack an airplane. And this is in the 1970s. And one of the things that he did is that he got on the plane and he sat all the way in the back. He bought a ticket all the way in the back. And when the stewardess came by to serve drinks and everything, he told her that he had a bomb in his briefcase. And she dismissed it. She was very attractive. So she thought that he was just hitting on her, but actually he was serious. And when she came by the second time, he handed her a note that said, "Miss, you need to sit down next to me." And then she did. She got a little bit intimidated, and he opened up his briefcase and he showed her the bomb. And so he did hijack the airplane. And what happened is they landed in Washington, And of course, the authorities, the FBI was already waiting. The authorities knew that he had a bomb in his plane or his briefcase on that plane. And what he did to negotiate with the FBI is he kept a couple of the stewardesses, actually two of the stewardesses, on board to use as hostages. And he allowed everybody else to leave the plane. And he gave specific instructions. I think he was going to fly to Mexico. And what happened in the middle of the flight is he jumped. And obviously he had a parachute. And even to this day, nobody knows what happened to him. So they don't know if he died or if he was getting picked up by somebody. And there are all these theories out there. And if we have time this semester, I'll show you a clip from Unsolved Mysteries where the authorities think that he died, but they're not sure. And one of the things that I do in class is we do this in-class activity and everybody writes their theories about what happened. So the point though of all this is that the stewardesses and the hostages, when it came to describing him, everybody had kind of a different description. And the stewardess, the main stewardess, said that the sketch that they came up with, the police sketch, actually looked nothing like him. But this illustrates, though, that everybody's blink reaction as to what this guy looked like was different. And this is because our brain's left hemisphere thinks differently in terms of words, and our right hemisphere views things in terms of pictures. And the same thing occurs with customer taste tests. And I'm going to show you a clip here with Malcolm Gladwell. He's going to be talking about Coke. And in the 1980s, there was this huge disaster where Coke changed its product, changed its ingredients. And Time magazine said later that this was the worst decision of the 20th century. And but there's a specific reason for that, because they did these taste tests and Coke was doing poorly against its main competitor, Pepsi. And you'll see that video shortly here. So this is interesting. You know how you go to Publix sometimes, or Costco, or Walmart, or whatever grocery store that you shop at? Sometimes there'll be companies out there that will give, samples out there. And so this one company did this jam test, jelly. And the first time that they tried this, they gave customers about 24 different choices of flavor. So they would have peach, apple, grape, cherry, like whatever it might, strawberry, whatever it might be, strawberry, cherry. And the customers had 24 choices to choose from. And this only resulted in about 3% of people that showed an interest in it. But when they reduced this to just 6 choices, this resulted in 10 times the effectiveness of the first time. Because we would think this kind of defies common sense, right? We think that we have more choices, then we're going to have more purchases. Sometimes that's true, but not all the time. Just by giving people simple 6 choices was more effective than 24 choices. So, okay, this is interesting, and I guess even timely considering what's happened in the last year, but in the 1980s, there was an incident in New York City where police shot an innocent man. And what happened was they were staking out this apartment complex or something, and they were looking for this specific criminal to try to arrest him. And what happened is at night, they saw this guy walking up there with like a bag. And so they went to confront him. And when he turned around, he had a bag or something in his hand. And the police mistakenly shot him. Now, these police had no criminal backgrounds or anything like that. They had good records. But what happens sometimes, the reason why this happened is that they had this blink reaction where they thought that the guy had like maybe a gun in his pocket and was about to shoot them. And what they found, psychologists later found, is that when they test people in group settings, our blink reactions are a lot different than what we do in individual settings. Sometimes when we're in group settings, because by the way, this was a group of police. So what happened though is that their blink reaction, sometimes when we're in group settings, we lose focus and we are more instinctive and more likely to make mistakes. So as a result of this, police departments started reducing the number of team units, because what they find is that in individual settings, individuals are slower, calmer, and make fewer mistakes. So this is interesting because I know that a lot of you are young, so you might not be car owners yet, but you will be eventually. I mean, some of you are, of course, or some of you rely on your parents' cars, or some people just ride the bus. And for college students and high school students, when you go into a dealership, what happens is that this guy talks about, his name was Bob Galome, and he was very effective at selling a lot of cars compared to his colleagues, compared to the other car salesmen. And what he said in interviews is that the reason for this is that he precisely avoids using his blink reactions. And what that means is that, for example, if you're young, if you look like a high school student or a college student, most car salesmen would not really take you seriously. But Bob Galome did take young people seriously. Now, why do you think he was successful? And think of this in terms of blink snap reactions. When somebody comes into your car dealership, why did he take young people just as seriously as the older people? Any guesses? Okay, that's part of it, Jose, because she gives the buyers more confidence, but also it's because most car salesmen, when a young person comes into their dealership, they think that this young person doesn't have money and is not likely to actually make a purchase. But guess what? Bob Galome figured out that, hey, when a young person comes into their dealership, yeah, they themselves are not going to buy a car, but guess who is? Why are they looking? Because mom and dad are likely to buy the car for them. So that's why he was successful, is not relying on his blink reactions, whereas other car salesmen would and just ignore the students. Okay, now this is also an interesting case that Gladwell talks about. There were these two brandy companies, E&J and the Christian Brothers. And E&J was really dominating the market. And they did all these, the Christian Brothers were trying to figure out why. They had the same product, and let's just say that they were priced evenly, okay? And when they did taste tests, they were equal. So the Christian Brothers did just as good as E&J in taste tests. And when they surveyed people, they found out that the Christian Brothers had a better name brand. When they asked people, I mean, I'm not familiar with Christian Brothers, but I mean, maybe it had more of a history, maybe it was older, but it had a better name brand. But what do you think, any guesses as to what they found the difference was between these products? Again, equal products, even with a better name brand, and let's just say that they were priced evenly. Just think of this in terms of blink. Okay, no, good guess, because yeah, the Christian Brothers, you would think like a religious affiliation, but actually that had nothing to do with it. Believe it or not, it was the bottle. The difference turned out to be the bottle. Customers saw the two products, the two bottles, and for whatever reason, E&J's bottle was better because, I don't know, maybe it was more colorful, and maybe the Christian Brothers bottle was just more generic, whatever it might be, but the difference turned out to be the bottle. People with their blink reactions would just see two products and then instantly just think that, oh, this product is packaged better, so it must be better. So can anybody think of examples where you bought a product just because maybe how it was packaged looked better compared to another competitor? I mean, I can give you another analogy. If you are a gamer, a video gamer, and you go to Best Buy or Walmart or wherever you shop, and you're browsing the games that they have on the shelves, and let's just say that you see a game that you have never heard of before, but maybe the box looks pretty cool, and the images on that box look pretty cool. Sometimes you're more likely to buy something just on your blink reaction to it, just by looking how a product is packaged. And other examples here, it turns out that when they did taste tests, 7-Up, for whatever reason, did poorly when they added yellow to the can. So they went back and changed their can, even though it's the same exact product with just yellow on the can turned out to turn customers off. Fruit products tend to taste test better in glass bottles compared to cans. Ice cream tested better in cylinder containers. So what these researchers would do, or what these companies would do, is that they would give customers taste tests, and same exact product, but just the way it was packaged turned out to affect the results. So here is Malcolm Gladwell talking about Coke versus Pepsi and why Coke made a huge mistake in the 1980s. In fact, they did so bad that they came out with a new Coke. And then when they found out that people hated it, they ended up going back to Coke. That's why if you go to buy a can, sometimes it'll say Coca-Cola Classic. And that's a direct result as why they changed back. It had something to do with a blink reaction. And this is pretty interesting.
Let's turn to marketing for a second, because one of the deemed greatest fiascos of modern time was the introduction of New Coke. Yeah. Now you see this entire fiasco also as a product of kind of overthinking on one hand and going to snap judgments at the same time.
Not understanding the complexity of snap judgments. I mean, New Coke, I can demonstrate this right here. This is what led to the New Coke fiasco. Pepsi was going around doing a Pepsi challenge, right? 2 identical cups. One is Coke, one is Pepsi. You don't know which is which. And I'm a dedicated Coke drinker. They say, take a sip of each, right? Sip, sip. Tell me which one you prefer. And I say, that one tastes better. And then they say, lo and behold, it's Pepsi. Coke saw this, panicked, and changed their formula, because it turns out that an incredible percentage of Coke drinkers preferred Pepsi in this blind taste test.
On their first little sip.
On their first little sip. What better evidence could that be that Pepsi's a better drink than Coke, right? So they've got to change it. So they changed the thing. Of course, it's a disaster. Why? So why was it wrong to conclude that they ought to change Coke from this test? Because Pepsi stacked the deck. They understood the sort of fickle nature of snap judgments, and they created a test that they would win. And the way they did that was that they asked people just to take a sip. When we just take a sip of a drink, we are almost always drawn to the sweeter of the two drinks.
Of which Pepsi is
sweet. Pepsi is sweeter than Coke. Pepsi will always win a sip test with Coke. If, on the other hand, you ask people to drink the whole can, they're inclined, less likely to like the sweet one, because the sweetness becomes cloying. And they'll go for the not so sweet one, Coke. If Pepsi had done the Pepsi challenge, only you had to drink the whole can, they would not have won. Coke would have won. Right? There's a case where how you measure someone's snap judgment, in other words, makes a huge impact on the answer that you get.
Well, in fact, you have a whole critique of market research, my chosen profession, and especially focus groups.
Yes, which I think suffer from this problem over and over again, which is that they assume that if someone has a reaction to something, that people, a snap judgment, they say, well, which drink do you prefer? Now tell me, why do you prefer this one to that one, right? And they assume that just because we can accurately say I prefer one to another, we can also provide an explanation of why we prefer one to another, and we can't. One of the greatest and most important truths of snap judgments is that they come from our unconscious, and as a result, they come from a part of the brain that we have no understanding of, or it's outside of our awareness. Our unconscious is a little box in our brain that we can't break into, right? It's the black box. You can't ask someone to explain something that they have no knowledge of. So what do people do in that situation? They make up stories. And I talk a lot about how the stories that people make up when they are required in these formal settings to explain why they have the feelings they do are nonsense. And more companies have made more disastrous decisions by literally interpreting the stories that consumers tell. Then it's a tremendous problem in the world of marketing.
Well, it's a perverse irony, isn't it, that now we're using people who are overanalyzing snap judgments.
Yes, exactly.
So you get the worst of all worlds.
And it requires, I mean, when I tell this to people like yourself in the market research profession, first of all, many of them have deep suspicions about the efficacy of focus groups. But also they recognize, many of them want to because they recognize what I'm arguing for is that the market researcher has to bring some level of skill and interpretation and sophistication to the products of market research.
You have to be an anthropologist.
You've got to be an anthropologist. You're not a statistician. And that's the thing, that people fell into this. They thought it was simple gathering of statistics. It's not. It requires a brain and some interpretation and some thoughtfulness. And that's the lesson, and one of the lessons of Blink, which is that when we're dealing with these enormously complex snap judgments, we can't take them at face value. We've got to understand where they're coming from.
Okay, so you see what he's talking about here. Just your Blink reaction, just taking a sip of something might taste better than another product that might not be so sweet, essentially. So Gladwell talks about this in the context of marketing, but also for your everyday life. So the next book that we'll talk about here is called Outliers, and what determines success. How much of it is a result of cultural factors. So this is where, I think I teased you guys last time as to what months of the year our successful people tend to be born in. He's going to explain that in this video. And then also what makes a pilot more likely to crash a plane. Like what country has the most plane crashes. And assuming that technically the planes are the same and the pilots are just as knowledgeable, there's a cultural component to this. But also he's going to talk about like what determines success in terms of like how hard you work tends to affect that a lot. So for example, he's going to talk about the Beatles, and everybody remembers the Beatles, of course, as one of the best rock bands of all time. And that's true, but there's a specific reason why they were so successful. It's because they worked incredibly hard. Most times when you go to a concert, you go to a concert where maybe it might be 2 hours, maybe a little bit longer. Well, the Beatles, for about 6 months before they ever became famous, were doing 8-hour sets in Hamburg, Germany. So we'll take a look at this real quick.
Malcolm Gladwell.
And actually, let me go back for a second too. This 10,000 hour rule, some of you may have heard of it, but again, this goes into how hard you work. In psychology, they say that to be successful in anything, whether we're talking about music or whatever, there's a 10,000 hour rule. So you do this activity for 10,000 hours before you truly become an expert.
Malcolm Gladwell is probably the best-selling nonfiction writer in America. Many millions of books based on events. Blink, should you trust your first impression? The Tipping Point, how does a fad become a sensation? His new book, which is my favorite, is called Outliers. In it, he explores what makes a person successful. Why do some talented people flame out early while others go on to brilliant careers? His main point is this: success doesn't have much to do with talent. Instead, he says it's almost always a product of hard work and of the culture in which one lives. Malcolm Gladwell, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
One of my favorite examples is actually your first example, where you talk about hockey players. And the reason I think you talk about them is because what could be more meritocratic than sports? You're just, it's not who your parents are. It's just a question of raw talent and hard work, it would seem. But what do you find?
where you find, some lovely work by a series of psychologists, what you find is that an overwhelming majority of hockey players are born in the first 3 months of the year, elite hockey players. And the same is true, by the way, of soccer around the world. And the reason for that is that the system under which age class hockey and age class soccer are organized has, has as the cutoff date January 1st. And so from the very beginning, when we pick young kids to pull them out and put them on all-star teams and give them special coaching and special encouragement, we're looking at groups of children who are all 9 years old, and we're saying those 3 are the best, let's pull them out. Well, who is the best at 9 years old? Well, it's children who are the eldest in their class, those born closest to the cutoff.
So the ones who are 9 years, 10 months, 9 years, 11 months, and 9 years, 11 and a half months, who tend to be the best.
When you're 9 years old, 11 months can be 4 inches in height. It can be 25 pounds. It can be the difference between being a klutz and someone who's incredibly coordinated. And so we think there that what we've done is identify people who have extraordinary individual talent. We actually haven't. We've created a system that confers a special benefit on children born in a certain part of the year, and that benefit persists. And those kids are the ones who end up 10 years later playing all-star, playing in the NHL, or playing professional football or soccer around the world.
Do you think this applies to, finance? That there were some kids who seemed at a young age a little bit more talented at math, and that they get a certain amount of attention by teachers and parents, and they're told they're smart, and then it's reinforced.
Yeah, this principle in psychology is called the Matthew effect, after the line in the Bible, he who has much more will be given, right? It's this idea that it's called cumulative advantage, which is small initial advantages mushroom over time. The best data we have is on reading. A very, very small difference in reading ability at a very young age quickly mushrooms into a large difference. Why? Because if you're a little bit better at reading at the age of 6, you'll read more, right? Because reading is easier, more pleasurable. And that little extra increment of reading that you do causes you to read even better than the person behind you. And the cycle reinforces itself until you have, by the time when kids are 6, the difference in the amount they read is like this. When they're 12, the same kids, the difference is this. It's because of this snowballing effect that happens with small initial advantages growing.
Tell the story of the Beatles with regard to practice.
The Beatles are a lovely example because we think that their story begins with the invasion of America in 1964, right? These 4 fresh-faced, practically teenagers who burst on the scene. Nothing could be further from the truth. They spend the really critical periods. They spend 2 years in Hamburg, Germany, as the house band in a strip club, playing 8-hour sets 7 days a week for months at a stretch. They have one of the most extraordinarily intensive apprenticeships in rock and roll. And if you think about what it takes to play, the typical set for a rock band is an hour and a half. They did 8-hour sets, day in, day out. If you think about that, you realize if you force a group of young musicians to play together over in that way for months at a stretch, you're forcing them to master all kinds of different genres, to learn how to play together well, to write songs. Everything you need to do, particularly at the dawn of rock and roll, to be the most dominant band of your generation, requires some kind of apprenticeship. And lo and behold, they have it. And I would argue, and many agree with me, that no Hamburg, no Beatles. They're just not the band that we remember unless they had that kind of intensive training.
But of course, it raises an interesting question to me, which is, you could imagine a lot of other bands being told, I've got good news for you. You've got a great gig in Hamburg, Germany. The bad news is you're going to have to play 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they would have said, no way, we're not going to do it. So something about that group made them relish the opportunity to do enormous amounts of practice. And presumably that's true of some of these sportsmen and true of other people. That is, yes, it takes practice, but you need a certain mentality to want to practice the hell out of it.
What you have described is what I believe talent is. Talent is the desire to practice, right? It is that you love something or so much that you're willing to make an enormous sacrifice and an enormous commitment to that, whatever it is, task, game, sport, what have you. when people use that word, we usually talk about something inherent in you, right? And we think of something very specific. I don't think that's what talent is. I think talent is simply desire. It's what you said of the Beatles. Their talent consisted of their ability to see Hamburg as an opportunity, whereas 99 out of 100 bands would have seen Hamburg as a nightmare, which, by the way, it was. I mean, you could argue that the Beatles' talent was also an act of delusion. To be able to see opportunity in Hamburg in 1959, required at the very least, an extraordinary imagination.
And we will be back with Malcolm Gladwell.
Okay, so the next clip, he's going to talk about what country is traditionally, not so much today, but was traditionally the worst at flying planes. And before I show this, any guesses? Well, this is interesting because plane crashes often don't have a lot to do with the pilot's competence or the plane's technology. Let's just say that you have two planes that are that the same exact plane, and you have one pilot from one country and another pilot from another country that are flying them. Because this is interesting. There's a cultural component to this.
Malcolm, when you talk about what succeeds, some of success and failure is not just the individuals, because as you say, that doesn't seem dominant. It's the environment around them, the culture around them. And some cultures, national cultures, seem better and worse.
Yeah.
You found that by and large, Koreans were very bad at being pilots. Explain
that. Being a good pilot, we think, is a matter of technical skill. It isn't really.
What about Sully Sullenberger?
Well, he's such an outlier to the theory of outliers. That's a very rare kind of plane crash. In fact, I don't know if there'd ever been a successful water landing in the last 50 years. Most crashes have a very different form. The overwhelming majority of crashes are the result of a breakdown in communication between the co-pilot and the pilot. Something comes up, a situation emerges that requires those two pilots to be in open and honest communication, and they fail to do that. One person withholds information, one person doesn't share, whatever. They're invariably social failures. So the question is, this is one component. Is it easier in some cultures for a subordinate to speak openly and honestly to his superior than in other cultures? And the answer is absolutely. In fact, this is one of the dimensions on which cultures vary the most. It's called power distance, right? It is the respect for hierarchy. And there are some cultures that have zero respect for hierarchy, and some cultures for which that is the dominant paradigm of social interaction. Korea, as it happens, is a culture which has enormous respect for hierarchy, where power distance is in fact, the entire linguistic structure of the Korean language is infused with this sense of how do I treat you if you are older and superior to me? I use specific pronounal forms. I mean, it goes on and on and on, right? Well, that is in 99% of cases, a beautiful and wonderful thing. In the cockpit, it's a problem, right? And so you see, whenever you see cultures, if you overlay the list of cultures in the world by their respect for power distance with the list of cultures in the world by their plane crashes per capita, it's basically the same list.
So it's the ones that are hierarchical that have the most plane crashes.
That have the most plane crashes. So you'll see, classic,
And what did Korean Airlines do?
Well, this is the second part of this argument, which is, this is not to say that certain cultures are incapable of doing that task. It just means that if they want to get better, they have to address the cultural component of their interaction. And that's exactly what Korean Air did. And they fixed their problem. Today, Korean Air was, through the 90s, one of the most dangerous airlines in the world. I mean, it was almost shut down at the end of the 90s by international aviation authorities. The Canadians told them at one point, you can't fly over Canada anymore. I mean, which is a real problem if you're trying to get from one end of the world to the other. And they fixed it. And they fixed it by bringing in people who have a different cultural attitude and essentially re-educating the pilots in Korean Airlines.
And they made them speak in English because they said it's a non-hierarchical language.
It's a non-hierarchical language. They wanted to think like, I mean, non-hierarchical cultures are America, Israel, Austria, Australia. They want them to think like Australians, essentially, right? What do? Well, you make them speak English, right? And it works. I mean, this is the sort of hopeful lesson at the core of my book, which is that when we acknowledge how much of success is embedded in culture, that's a hopeful thing because culture is malleable. It's something we can address if we put our minds to it.
So when you look at America today, what elements of our culture are producing the kind of problems we see? A bad education system, for example.
Yeah. I think that we have carried in the educational realm, we have carried our obsession with individualism too far. And paradoxically, we have an enormous amount to learn, I think, from Asian cultures like Korea. I mean, just as they can learn from us on flying planes, we can learn from them on education. If you go to Korea or China or Hong Kongers and you ask them, what does it take to be good at math? Their answer would be, being good at math is a function of how hard you work, right? Now, hard work is something that is available to all students, regardless of intellectual ability. So when you come in with that perspective, your expectation is everyone can work. The dull child can work as hard as, in fact, the dull child may find it easier to work harder than the smart child. That work-based perspective on achievement allows you, I think, to serve the needs of a much broader pool of students than we have an ability-based approach, right? We're constantly segregating kids according to their aptitude, right? Whatever on earth that is. You know, I think we would do well to banish that word and simply, I think we should separate kids according to how hard they want to work. You know, the kids who want to do their homework ought to be in one, you know, and if you don't want to do your homework, I think we should say, then you have a problem. And I don't care if you have an IQ of 150, you have a problem. You know, you have to, a work-based culture is, at the end of the day, a far more effective means of raising the middle.
Malcolm Gladwell, thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig.
And we will be right back.
So what he's saying there, and I hope you get the point, is that in the cockpit, if a plane is having problems, the co-pilot might notice this, but in places like Korea at one time, they were scared to kind of speak up to the main pilot because they think, oh, they're my superior. They must know what they're doing. And I don't want to say anything because that might be disrespectful. And the same thing, by the way, happens with doctors and surgeons. Sometimes you might have a doctor's assistant or a nurse that might notice that a doctor is maybe making a mistake, but he or she doesn't say anything because they think, oh, well, first of all, they're the doctor. They must know what they're doing. But secondly, it would be disrespectful to speak up and tell them about that. So kind of interesting. And I can also tell you a couple other things when he was talking about hard work there. I'll give you a couple basketball player examples. He talks, not in this book, but he talks in just in speeches and articles and so forth about a basketball player from Detroit named Derek Coleman. And what all the sports experts said is that this guy had like almost the most talent that they've ever seen, but he didn't want to work and ended up, I mean, he was still a good player, but they said that he could have been so much better had he worked a lot harder. Another example would be a guy from Arkansas named Darnell Robinson. And this guy was not successful, but coming out of high school, he was a phenom. They were predicting that he would later on become the #1 pick of the draft after college and so forth. And he just didn't want to work. And I mean, there are so many different examples in sports and so forth. Now for his next book here, it's called David and Goliath. And this is kind of why I wanted you guys to do the timed essay on the power of underdogs, because we're going to go through some slides on Wednesday about this, but he uses the story of the biblical story in the Old Testament, David and Goliath. Now, of course, everybody thinks that David was the underdog and Goliath was the giant. Well, actually, if you look closely at the text, that wasn't the case at all. In fact, David was more likely to defeat Goliath. And like in the 1960s, a lot of psychologists started to examine, and a lot of medical experts started to examine the specific language of the text in the Bible. And they noticed a few things. So just because for the other class, we didn't get into this, so I'll save this for next time. But let me just do one thing. So we'll go through all this on Wednesday, but okay, take a look at this example. Now, some of you have seen this before. I know they do this with a lot of high school students, but this is what we call CRT test. So take a look at this question here. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So what do you guys think? Yeah, Helena, that's what everybody says. Actually, the answer is 5 cents because the bat costs $1.05, which is $1 more than 5 cents, which is what the ball costs. But the reason why I'm bringing this up here is because when they do this test on 2 groups of students, same academic level, same intelligence and everything, one group of students tends to do better on this question than the other group. And there's a specific reason for it, and it kind of defies common sense. So I know I'm showing you guys a lot of videos today, but I do want to show you this. It's a little bit long. It's about 15 minutes or so. And I used to have this embedded in the slides itself, but so we'll do this and wrap up with a couple other things here, and then we'll meet again probably on Wednesday. But Helena, I'll let you know actually, and I'm still thinking about what we could do tomorrow, but I'll let you know in the announcements. But what Gladwell says here is that this little story from the Old Testament is actually a metaphor for modern life.
So I wanted to tell a story that that really obsessed me when I was writing my new book. And it's a story of something that happened 3,000 years ago when the kingdom of Israel was in its infancy. And it takes place in an area called the Shephelah in what is now Israel. And the reason the story obsessed me is that I thought I understood it. And then I went back over it and I realized that I didn't understand it at all. Ancient Palestine had along its eastern border, there's a mountain range, still same is true of Israel today. And in the mountain range are all of the ancient cities of that region. So Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron. And then there's a coastal plain right along the Mediterranean where Tel Aviv is now. And connecting the mountain range with the coastal plain is an area called the Shephelah, which is a series of valleys and ridges that run east to west. And you can follow the Shephelah, go through the Shephelah to get from the coastal plain to the mountains. And the Shephelah, if you've been to Israel, you'll know it's just about the most beautiful part of Israel. It's gorgeous with forests of oak and wheat fields and vineyards. But more importantly, though, in the history of that region, it's had a real strategic function. And that is, it is the means by which hostile armies on the coastal plain find their way, get up into the mountains and threaten those living in the mountains. And 3,000 years ago, that's exactly what happens. The Philistines, who are the biggest of enemies of the kingdom of Israel, are living in the coastal plain. They're originally from Crete. They're a seafaring people. And they start to make their way through one of the valleys of the Shephelah up into the mountains, because what they want to do is occupy the highland area right by Bethlehem and split the kingdom of Israel in two. And the kingdom of Israel, which is headed by King Saul, obviously catches wind of this, and Saul brings his army down from the mountains, and he confronts the Philistines in the valley of Elah. one of the most beautiful of the valleys of the Shephelah. And the Israelites dig in along the northern ridge, and the Philistines dig in along the southern ridge. And the two armies just sit there for weeks and stare at each other because they're deadlocked. Neither can attack the other, because to attack the other side, you've got to come down the mountain into the valley and then up the other side, and you're completely exposed. So finally, to break the deadlock, the Philistines send their mightiest warrior down into the valley floor. And he calls out and he says to the Israelites, send your mightiest warrior down and we'll have this out, just the two of us. This was a tradition in ancient warfare called single combat. It was a way of settling disputes without incurring the bloodshed of a major battle. And the Philistine who's sent down, their mighty warrior, is a giant. He's 6'9". He's outfitted head to toe in this glittering bronze armor. And he's got a sword, and he's got a javelin, he's got a spear. He is absolutely terrifying. And he's so terrifying that none of the Israelite soldiers want to fight him. It's a death wish, right? There's no way they think they can take him. And finally, the only person who will come forward is this young shepherd boy. And he goes up to Saul and he says, I'll fight him. And Saul says, you can't fight him. That's ridiculous. You're this kid. This is this mighty warrior. But the shepherd is adamant. He says, no, you don't understand. I have been defending my flock against lions and wolves for years. I think I can do it. And Saul has no choice. No one else has come forward. So he says, all right. And then he turns to the kid and he says, but you've got to wear this armor. You can't go as you are. So he tries to give the shepherd his armor, and the shepherd says, no. He says, I can't wear this stuff. The biblical verse is, I cannot wear this, for I have not proved it. Meaning, I've never worn armor before. You got to be crazy. So he reaches down instead on the ground and picks up 5 stones and puts them in his shepherd's bag and starts to walk down the mountainside to meet the giant. And the giant sees this figure approaching and calls out, come to me so I can feed your flesh to the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field, right? He issues this kind of taunt towards this person coming to fight him. And the shepherd draws closer and closer, and the giant sees that he's carrying a staff. That's all he's carrying, right? Instead of a weapon, just this shepherd's staff. And he says, he's insulted. Am I a dog that you would come to me with sticks, right? And the shepherd boy takes one of his stones out of his pocket, puts it in his sling, and whirls it around and lets it fly, and it hits the giant right between the eyes, right here, in his most vulnerable spot. And he falls down either dead or unconscious, and the shepherd boy runs up and takes his sword and cuts off his head. And the Philistines see this, and they turn and they just run. And of course, the name of the giant is Goliath, and the name of the shepherd boy is David. And the reason that story has obsessed me over the course of writing my book is that everything I thought I knew about that story turned out to be wrong. So David in that story is supposed to be the underdog, right? In fact, that term, David and Goliath, has entered our language as a metaphor for improbable victories by some weak party over someone far stronger. Now, why do we call David an underdog? Well, we call him an underdog because he's a kid, little kid, and Goliath is this big, strong giant. We also call him an underdog because Goliath is an experienced warrior and David is just a shepherd, right? But most importantly, we call him an underdog because all he has is that Goliath is outfitted with all of this modern weaponry, like this glittering coat of armor and a sword and a javelin and a spear, and all David has is this sling. Well, let's start there with the phrase, all David has is this sling, because that's the first mistake that we make. In ancient warfare, there are 3 kinds of warriors. There's cavalry, men on horseback and with chariots. There's heavy infantry, which are foot soldiers, armed foot soldiers with swords and shields and some kind of armor. And there's artillery. And artillery are archers, but more importantly, slingers. And a slinger is someone who has a leather pouch with 2 long cords attached to it. And they put a projectile, either a rock or a lead ball, inside the pouch. And they whirl it around like this. And they let one of the cords go. And the effect is to send the projectile forward at towards its target. That's what David has. And it's important to understand that that sling is not a slingshot. It's not this, right? It's not a child's toy. It's in fact an incredibly devastating weapon. When David rolls it around like this, he's turning the sling around probably at 6 or 7 revolutions per second. And that means that when the rock is released, it's going forward really fast, probably 35 meters per second. That's substantially faster than baseball thrown by even the finest of baseball pitchers. More than that, the stones in the Valley of Elah were not normal rocks. They were barium sulfate, which are rocks twice the density of normal stones. If you do the calculations on the stopping power of the rock fired from David's sling, it's roughly equal to the stopping power of a 45 millimeter handgun. Right? This is an incredibly devastating weapon. Accuracy, we know from historical records that slingers experienced slingers could hit and maim or serious or even kill a target at distances of up to 200 yards. From medieval tapestries, we know that slingers were capable of hitting birds in flight. They're incredibly accurate, right? When David lines up, and he's not 200 yards away from Goliath, he's quite close to Goliath. When he lines up and fires that thing at Goliath, he has every intention and every expectation of being able to hit Goliath at his most vulnerable spot between his eyes. If you go back over the history of ancient warfare, you will find time and time again that slingers were the decisive factor against infantry in one kind of battle, against heavy infantry in one kind of battle or another. So what's Goliath? He's heavy infantry. And his expectation when he challenges the Israelites to a duel is that he's going to be fighting another heavy infantryman, right? When he says, "Come to me that I might feed your flesh to the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field," the key phrase is "come to me." Come up to me, because we're going to fight hand to hand like this. Saul has the same expectation. David says, "I want to fight Goliath," and Saul tries to give him his armor because Saul is thinking, oh, when you say fight Goliath, you mean fight him in hand-to-hand combat, infantry on infantry. But David has absolutely no expectation. No, he's not going to fight him that way. Why would he? He's a shepherd. He's spent his entire career using a sling to defend his flock against lions and wolves. That's where his strength lies. So here he is, this shepherd, experienced in the use of a devastating weapon, up against this lumbering giant, weighed down by 100 pounds of armor and these incredibly heavy weapons that are useful only in short-range combat. Goliath is a sitting duck. He doesn't have a chance, right? So why do we keep calling David an underdog? Why do we keep referring to victory as improbable? It's the second piece of this that's important. It's not just that we misunderstand David and his choice of weaponry. It's also that we profoundly misunderstand Goliath. Goliath is not what he seems to be. There's all kinds of hints of this in the biblical text. Things that are, in retrospect, are quite puzzling and don't square with his image as this mighty warrior. So to begin with, the Bible says that Goliath is led onto the valley floor by an attendant. Now that is weird, right? Here is this mighty warrior challenging the Israelites to one-on-one combat. Why is he being led by the hand by some, young boy, presumably, to the point of combat? Secondly, the Bible story makes special note of how slowly Goliath moves. Another odd thing to say when you're describing the mightiest warrior known to man at that point, right? And then there's this whole weird thing about how long it takes Goliath to react to the sight of David. So David's coming down the mountain, and he's clearly not preparing for hand-to-hand combat, right? There is nothing about him that says, I'm about to fight you like this. He's not even carrying a sword. Why does Goliath not react to that? It's as if he's oblivious to what's going on that day. And then there's that strange comment he makes to David. Am I a dog that you should come to me with sticks, right? Sticks? David only has one stick. Well, it turns out that there's been a great deal of speculation within the medical community over the years about whether there's something fundamentally wrong with Goliath, an attempt to make sense of all of those apparent anomalies. There have been many articles written. The first one was in 1960 in the Indiana Medical Journal. And it started a chain of speculation that starts with an explanation for Goliath's height. So Goliath is head and shoulders above all of his peers in that era. And usually when someone is that far out of the norm, there's an explanation for it. So the most common form of giantism is a condition called acromegaly. And acromegaly is caused by a benign tumor on your pituitary gland that causes an overproduction of human growth hormone. And throughout history, many of the most famous giants have all had acromegaly. So the tallest person of all time was a guy named Robert Wadlow, who was still growing when he died at the age of 24, and he was 8'11". He had acromegaly. Do you remember the wrestler Andre the Giant, famous? He had acromegaly. There's even speculation that Abraham Lincoln had acromegaly. Anyone who's unusually tall, that's the first explanation we come up with. And acromegaly has a very distinct set of side effects associated with it, principally having to do with vision. The pituitary tumor, as it grows, often starts to compress the visual nerves in your brain, with the result that people with acromegaly have either double vision or they are profoundly nearsighted. So when people have started to speculate about what might have been wrong with Goliath, they said, wait a minute, he looks and sounds an awful lot like someone who has acromegaly. And that would also explain so much of what was strange about his behavior that day, right? Why does he move so slowly and have to be escorted down into the valley floor by an attendant? Because he can't make his way on his own, right? Why is he so strangely oblivious to David that he doesn't understand that David's not going to fight him until the very last moment? Because he can't see him, right? When he says, come to me that I might feed your flesh to the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the field, the phrase come to me is a hint also of his vulnerability. Come to me because I can't see you, right? And then there's, am I a dog that you should come to me with sticks? He sees 2 sticks when David has only 1. So the Israelites up on the mountain ridge looking down on him thought he was this extraordinarily powerful foe. What they didn't understand was that the very thing that was the source of his apparent strength was also the source of his greatest weakness. And there is, I think, in that a very important lesson for all of us. Giants are not as strong and powerful as they seem. And sometimes the shepherd boy has a sling in his pocket.
Okay, so you get the idea there. So we'll go through some slides on Wednesday more in this book. One thing I just want to show you, and forgive me if I did this at the beginning of class, because I know I did this at the end of the last class. So forgive me if we did this at the beginning of this class, but somebody last time was asking about the library and how you can access resources. So let me just open up the chat box. Okay, so the easiest way, and there's different ways to get to our library, but the easiest way, at least the easiest way for me that I always do this, is you just maybe go on Google, go to our library, and I mean, there's different ways you can find this. You can actually search for journal titles and databases. Just the easiest thing to do though is just right here with the search. And let's just say that we're looking up King Arthur. Now, okay, I'm already logged in, but it might ask you to log in. So just use your normal password. And let's just say that we're looking for, and also another thing, I mean, you guys can search for books if you want. You can use books. The easiest way to do this though, because I assume that most of you are going to be using articles. So you want to click that. And let's find one with a, okay. So down here, you would click on full text. And okay, so you'll have access to the full text, but one thing I just want to show you real quick that'll make things easier for you is right here. Now this doesn't appear on every single article, but you're always going to see cite here. Now it might not always give you all these formats, but it gives you formats for citation. So you would go down to MLA, and simply all you would do is a copy and paste. And that's an easy way to cite for your work cited. That way you don't have to like look at the format, oh, author, and then you put the article title, and then the journal title, and then the volume number, but just copy and paste all this and it does it for you. And by the way, you'll be using our library resources for the final project. You'll have to actually find 6 sources, but we'll go into that later. Now though, in terms of bonus sessions, we probably could do one tomorrow, but one of the things that I'm thinking about doing, it might be a short one. I might actually just show you an episode from Forensic Files. Have you guys ever heard of that show? Okay, great. Because the reason why I bring this up is that a couple of students last semester, they ultimately didn't do their topic on this, but has anybody ever heard of Darlie Routier from Texas? It has. So there's an episode of Forensic Files that is just fascinating. I mean, most episodes are fascinating anyways, but this issue with Darlie Routier has been coming up in the news lately because she currently sits on death row and her case actually got delayed because of the virus. So the court is in recess right now, but there's a fascinating case because there are some people that think she's innocent. And the episode that I'll show you is actually, it actually leaves out some important details. But I tend to agree with the prosecution in that case. But still though, the reason why I bring this up is because it has been in the news and a couple of students last semester wanted to do their research paper on this. So maybe we can do that tomorrow. The only thing about that though, is I'm not sure about the time. So I'll let you know about the time, but I'll record it though. And then we can have a discussion afterwards. So at this point, are there any questions? Yeah, Helena, I think so, yeah. Okay, cool. So we'll meet again Wednesday for sure, and probably tomorrow, but I don't know what time. It'll just be a bonus session. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so remember this is recording, so I'll post this on YouTube later today, so you can always go back to it. Okay, so we'll see everybody Wednesday for sure, and maybe tomorrow.